On my recent top 10 bronze player mistakes video that I made, I talked about counter building briefly. Afterwards I get a lot of questions from different people asking how do I know how to counter build properly, what do I need to counter build. Obviously this is a very wide topic, it's very much almost impossible to cover it in one video, and a lot of it are things that you will learn over time, things that are specific to certain gods, etc. But what I think is possible is give you an overview of at least the items that do counter specific things for the most part and that are more popular for this in the general context and that you can frequently implement into your builds. As such, I will talk about specific items that counter specific things and when you will apply them, how often you will apply them compared to others, and how they're useful specifically. I will not talk about relics in this video because that would just cover too much in a single video, but I will talk about all the items for both magical and physical characters that at least exist in the game. I'm not saying that everyone can build every item. To keep it a little bit structured, I will always talk about the one counter that exists to a thing and then potentially the counter that exists against that or the other thing that functions against it. With that said, let's get started. The first thing we have are slows. The item that counters slows best in Smite is Winged Blade, without a doubt. Winged Blade can be built on a lot of characters, almost any character I would say, if the situation really requires it. Even in the SPL we've recently seen it on a Skadi, so it's not very restrictive, though some roles can pick it up easier than others, but that applies for every item. On the other hand, we have countering mobility through slows or other means. The first two items that come up here are Frostbound Hammer for physicals and Gem of Isolation for mages. You will see both from time to time, Frostbound Hammer not being that popular at the moment because it doesn't really fit into most builds too well, Gem of Isolation being a little more fitting into mage builds, but both of them not being the most popular items out there. As a support specifically, you can counter the enemy's mobility as well if you are, for example, a Geb versus an Athena by getting Traveler's Shoes or if you're physical Talaria boots. So this extra mobility will make you kind of more even with the enemy. Not specifically a counter item in a traditional sense, but I felt it was worth pointing out here. When it comes to heal, the typical counter items are Brawler's Beatstick, Divine Ruin and Pestilence. These are the ones that are most reliably applied and see the most frequent use, depending on which role you're playing. Any Assassin, many solos, even if they want to go for some damage, go for Brawlers. Otherwise, solos and supports will go for Pestilence, and the mages will go for Divine Ruin. There is also Witchblade, which has a similar effect, which has healing reduction after a few hits. The problem here is that obviously you have to apply those hits first, and as such it doesn't work as well for every character. Many characters will have to have sufficient attack speed to apply the hits fast enough, and they will have to have a way to fit it into their build properly to make it effective in the first place. That is in itself very restrictive and doesn't allow too many gods to use this item effectively, but it is out there. Then, to counter ANTIHEAL through Amplified Healing, you have Rod of Asclepius. Rod of Asclepius does not do quite as much as the ANTIHEAL items though, so that's something worth keeping in mind. It just can amplify your healing a little bit. The next section is more towards hard crowd control. Now, there are items in Smite that have hard crowd control attached to them, Mantle of Discord for example, but those are relatively rare and don't really need to be pointed out on the one side. It's more about the items that counter crowd control in some way. If you are against an enemy team comp that has a lot of crowd control and follows that crowd control up with some sort of burst damage, then Spirit Rope is your best choice. This is often good when the enemy really has a lot of hard crowd control. You're expecting to get CC'd when you get in a team fight, you're expecting to take a lot of damage, then Spirit Rope is your best bet in regards to effective health as well. If the enemy team has knockbacks, pulls or grabs, Stone of Gaia is great. It also offers some nice sustain on top of that. It's not for every character equally, but those who can fit it into their builds can make great use of it against certain characters. For example, Ares pull as well now. Against isolated, impactful crowd control, say for example our Kwang ultimate, who only has hard crowd control in his ultimate, you can get Magi's Blessing. This works best when the enemy team does not have too much crowd control, not too many easy ways to get the bubble, as it's called, off you, but rather if they have some strong instances of crowd control that often affect you and not allow you to get away in teamfight, and you may not be able to fit Purification Beads into your build or something alike. To counter stealth, there are two main ways in the items, and that's Bluestone Pendant for early on and Mystical Mace for later. Tick damage will always show stealth characters, either by completely revealing them like Ao Kwang, or by at least showing the damage numbers above them, like it is the case with Loki. So having tick damage against any sort of character with stealth is always good. Tick damage itself can also be countered, not to the extent that you would not be revealed as a stealth character, but in generally any lower instance of damage that applies multiple times is countered very well by Mark of the Vanguard. So if the enemy team has a lot of damage over time, a lot of dots, then Mark of the Vanguard is a great choice against that. At this point we're getting into the more specific counters that don't really have the counters like the ones beforehand had, because they're mostly countering damage, and realistically almost any item in Smite has damage, so it doesn't really make sense to list all of them on the other side here. Instead we'll just focus on the one that counters specific kinds of damage. The first one is basic attack focus damage. Against basic attack focus damage, the best direct counter is Hide of the Nemean Lion, as it reflects parts of the damage back directly. This is better the more tanky you are, the more health you have and everything, and this one I would specifically say is especially good against ranged characters that tend to attack you. The other option is Midgardian Mail. This one slows the character attacking and slows the attack speed, and this one I say personally is a little bit better against melees. Obviously both work against both, but the reason I'm saying this is because a hunter can still shoot you from range, and if he's slowed down, it won't care that much after all, whereas a melee that can't reach you in range anymore will suffer more from it, but usually the benefit from the Nemean in itself is a little higher. But both are very valid choices. Against burst, you have to kind of decide which kind of burst it is, but something that kind of works against every burst, even though it is against mages specifically, is Bulwark of Hope. It is against magical damage, but the extra health shield works against no matter what, so in the end it's a very good choice against burst damage. Other choices here are Mantle of Discord and Blackthorn Hammer. I would say Mantle of Discord is vastly superior here. It just has that crowd control that pops off automatically, gives you crowd control immunity when you get low, and all in all allows you to survive in many situations where you would otherwise have died due to being under crowd control on that health level. Blackthorn Hammer should theoretically do a similar thing. The problem is that the item is just a bit more, well, let's say iffy in regards to its stats and doesn't work as well for many gods, so it's not picked up as often, but it exists as well, so I'm throwing it out there. And then we're getting super specific. For close range mages, there's ANTIHEAL. ANTIHEAL is an item that silences enemies after attacking you with a magical attack, but only in a relatively short radius, so the enemy has to be close in order to be silenced, and that way you can hopefully get away from that mage relatively quickly. This is a very specific counter. It works very well against, for example, Ao Kuang. It is generally not a favorite item, but in the few situations where it can be applied, it can be quite good. Against early damage burst as a mage, this is something that I didn't originally want to put in, but I think is important to know. You can start with Vampiric Shroud, usually not the best option, but what you can also do is build Dynasty Plate Helm. This is a magical item with physical defense, and it will protect you from junglers, and it protects you especially from physical early aggression junglers, and there are a lot of those, and many players don't seem to pick that item up very often, when really it would drastically increase your survivability in the early stages of the game while also giving you nice amounts of extra damage. Later in the game, there are many more options for mages to counter burst, like Book of the Dead, Ethereal Staff, Warlock's Sash, Gem of Isolation, but we don't need to go into detail here. Just getting the idea that you can build some health, or you can even consider going into one of the normal anti-burst, anti-CC items. Can be very beneficial for mages as well. Then there are counters to stacking, and by stacking I don't mean specifically stacking items, but rather just building a lot of one stat. If the enemy is power stacking, it depends on which kind of power we're talking about, but against a physical god that's stacking a lot of power, you can build a Kaival to steal parts of their power and have more of a hit against them. Against magicals, you can likewise build Silverbench Bow, and against magicals you can also build Runic Shield. Against health stacking, if a tank for example does that, there is Kin Size, that's a primary choice here, and then there's also Soul Reaver and Ethereal Staff, which both work. Against protection stacking, you just want any kind of penetration, percentage protection reduction, or very high flat reduction values. In terms of physicals, that's Titan's Bane and Executioner. In terms of magicals, that's Obsidian Shard, but also Demonic Grip and Spear of the Magus, though these are picked up a little less. But yeah, they kind of work for the same purpose, and Spear of the Magus in itself has so much flat reduction that it's kind of able to keep up with the percentage ones. To counter structure damage, there is Emperor's Armor, a very nice effect on towers that slows their attack speed, and it also kind of counters sieging from the enemy team because it will increase the attack speed of your towers too. So overall, nice benefit in both regards, and probably becoming more popular, especially now that some other items are getting changed. In terms of aura items, we have certain auras in the game that counter certain kinds of damage. This is not specifically a counter to an interaction, but more to a sort of damage. But as it helps your whole team, I felt like pointing it out before ending this video. And that's Sovereignty against physical damage, Hardwood Amulet against magical damage, and God of Thebes against both kinds of damage equally. These items are always great counters depending on the enemy matchup. If they have a lot of magicals, you as a support should consider getting Hardwood Amulet, for example, or if they have a lot of physicals, Sovereignty, or if you think it's a mix of both, Thebes. So depending on the situation, you should choose here. Though, once again, we see some changes to these items at the moment, so they may lose some popularity overall, but they will still be very strong in many specific situations. With that, thank you guys for watching. I hope this gave you a little bit of a glimpse into the world of countering. There's a lot more to this topic. I can definitely not cover that all in this one video, but I will go into that more specifically. With that, thank you guys for watching. I would very much appreciate if you click the sub button if you're not subscribed yet. It really helps me out. And maybe the bell next to it too, then you get notified of my new videos. See you for the next one tomorrow. ZiSotto, out.